And with that, let's just get into what a one-credit clear is. So fundamentally, a one-credit clear is the idea that you can put in one coin and make it through the entire game all the way to the end credits, and you're done. So in theory, you can walk up to that game in any arcade anywhere and beat it in one go. It's kind of the ultimate mark of accomplishment for an arcade title, and especially for a shooting game. Other than trying to set a high score, which is sort of an even loftier goal in and of itself, the one-credit clear is kind of the first major milestone. It maximizes kind of the economy of play. You don't need to have to spend a lot of money to have a good time. Once you get to a certain skill level, it's really quite simple to go and just enjoy yourself. So, I really have to emphasize how amazing it feels. It's not something that I can really describe. It's this very kind of visceral adrenaline rush, reaching the end of the game, and you're so close to screwing up. You know that everything's about to fall apart, but then somehow miraculously you pull through. It's very different from anything I've experienced from a console game, because there's really no guarantee that you'll make it through except for your own skill. So you really have to kind of trust in yourself there. And then once you clear a game, it's kind of psychologically liberating because it lets you experiment a lot more. You know that you're competent at the game, so you feel free to kind of explore more and push the boundaries of what you can do with score play, which is a bit more high level. So this is a quote from Clover Tak, who's one of the most famous super players, is what they're called. Basically Japanese minor celebrities in the arcade scene who more or less make a living off of playing games at an incredibly high level. Not only do they clear the game, but they clear the game perfectly. They get the highest scores in the world. They record replays and distribute them. They have DVDs made that cover their strategies and commentary on these things. So he I think he has a wonderful philosophy about technique in shooting games. He says, I often see players dodging through hard patterns and think to myself, this person is probably not a great player. A good player avoids bullets. He does not need to dodge them. And at first it sounds really silly, like what the hell's the difference? But avoid implies kind of the idea that there's no chance that he will be hit ever, whereas dodging is more reflexive, it's more active. So I think the idea that he's trying to convey is that once you reach a certain level of mastery, you no longer have to worry about what's going on the screen, which becomes important when you start seeing things like this. So this is kind of fundamental techniques, the difference between macro dodging and micro dodging. So macro dodging is essentially the idea of dodging entire patterns all at once. You have some kind of spreads and lines coming down right here, and you're just moving off to the side, and nothing's going to bother to hit you. But sometimes you can't do that. And in this case here, there's kind of this giant snafu going on, and you have to weave through the bullets on an individual level. And they're both very, very different skill sets. Macro dodging often involves specific positioning, or timing yourself well, or knowing the enemy location so that you can move from one side of the screen to another, whereas micro dodging is much more reflexive. In general, you can even categorize kind of shooting games based on how much emphasis they place on one or the other. The Toho series, for example, are very heavy on incredibly dense patterns that require micro dodges, whereas Toho-clone games are generally much more macro heavy. They're kind of more classic arcade style. You might be familiar with Raiden, which is another great example. And then kind of more fundamental technique. Tap dodging is the idea that probably 95% of the bullets in any given game are going to be pointed straight at you, which means that you don't actually have to move very far to get out of the way. So kind of the fundamental idea of the tap dodge is that you want to move as little as possible to avoid a large clump of bullets and then continue that motion as much as necessary until you're safe. So in this case, you see there's all of these bullets coming in from up here, but they're all converging at a single point because that's where the player was when those enemies started firing. Now, all you have to do is move over the length of your hitbox, which in this case is a very, very tiny circle, and you're suddenly safe. So So I've illustrated this here with the next couple frames from that replay, where you can see that the player moves over just a tiny, tiny bit more, but he's managing to dodge all of these, giant swarms of bullets, which would otherwise be rather difficult to control. So this is a very, very fundamental technique, and you have to adjust it a little bit depending on what you're playing, based on the size of your hitbox, the speed of enemy bullets, that kind of thing. But in general, it's a very straightforward thing to do. But it's kind of counterintuitive. Your first instinct when you see all these bullets on the screen is, oh my god, I have to get out of the way. The best way to handle it is to stay still for as long as you can and just move in tiny increments.
Yeah, so you're not taking your joystick or your pad or your keyboard, you're not making huge sweeping movements and kind of like, oh, I'm going to panic. You're going to keep your steel and resolve and kind of maintain your control. And that's like the real great tension about the game, too.
Yeah. And kind of building on that is this idea of bullet hurting. In essence, again, because the majority of the bullets on the screen are going to be aimed at the player, you can actually control how they flow. So by making certain moves, you can direct a pattern over to one side of the screen versus another, or you can set yourself up for something that you need to do in a minute. So in this case, in order to kind of cut across the top of the screen here, I started a move down here over to the side, and then I'm allowing these enemies up here to start shooting at me right there, because I know that I'm not going to be there by the time those bullets actually pose a threat. So this is often a very contextual thing. It's difficult to understand when and how to herd bullets for this kind of application unless you've played the game before. But it's a very useful technique otherwise, because you'll have some aimed pattern, and if you get high up on the screen off to one side, you can just have it all shot off to that side, and then you just move over and have it shot off to this side, and move over, have it shot off to that side. It's a very helpful thing to know. And then cutting back is probably the most difficult of kind of the fundamental shooting game techniques, because it's difficult to explain and even harder to learn to execute properly. But the basic idea is that if you're continually tap dodging off to one side, eventually you're going to hit the corner of the screen, and then you can't move, and then you're going to die, and that's not good. So what you have to do is cut back through the stream of bullets. And to do that, you have to make a small opening by herding them in one direction, and then cut downwards through that opening so that you can travel backwards relative to the way you were moving before.
Yeah, and you can tap dodge onto the other side of the screen.
So here, you can see that there's kind of two distinct streams of bullets. The player was here, and then moved up here, and that's created this opening. Then over here, he slid sideways through the opening, and the bullets are all now directed over here, so we can continue moving this way across the screen. One of the most basic questions that people ask when they start getting into shooting games is, where do I look? You see a pattern like this, and it's visually overwhelming. There's so much going on, it's difficult to know what you're supposed to be doing. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was that you shouldn't be looking at the bullets themselves. You should be looking at the spaces between them. The majority of what's on the screen is not dangerous to you. So in this example, the only things that can actually hit me are right here. And kind of, I created these kind of maps here based on like probability, like where I'm spending most of my time looking. So in this case, I'm spending most of my time looking at the area right around my ship, and I'm only peripherally aware of everything else. It's also really important not to always be looking down. It's great in a situation like this where you have to be dodging something really, really dense, but if you're in something looser, something more active, it's important to be able to move around and visually explore the playfield. So, you shouldn't always be looking at your ship. And a lot of bullet hell games have a very vertical emphasis within the player shot stream, which gives you this kind of line like this. You can kind of barely see it under the bullets here. And that will let you kind of get this intuitive sense for where you are on the screen.
Yeah, what I like to do when I'm playing is, too, when you're looking at bullets, don't look at the bullets so much per se, but look at the space between the bullets. So you're going to draw like a kind of an imaginary line where from one bullet to the next closest bullet, and then you think, that's empty space. That's where I want to maneuver my ship to. And what you can do, since it comes in a pattern of a stream, you can kind of trace the empty space between the bullets and then plan your path accordingly for your ship.
So here, just using another couple slides that I showed earlier, you know, on the left we have the tap dodging, where really the only thing that I'm concerned about is what's being shot at the time. So I'm not even looking at my ship at all. I'm looking at the enemies that are firing at me at any given moment, and then sliding over a little bit as I need to. Or in this case, with the cutback example, all I really care about is where that opening is. Nothing else is going to hit me. I know that from experience and from how I'm moving. So I just need to care about that little opening. More kind of general advice. It's important to pay attention to where and why you die. It sounds really straightforward. It's like, oh, I screwed up here, so I should remember that. But it actually becomes very significant, because if, for example, you notice that you keep dying to a certain pattern, you can start to kind of think about ways to overcome that. Are you failing to dodge this pattern because it's too fast? Are you failing to dodge it because it's too dense? Is it impossible to dodge? Because there are some games that are really mean like that. And you can develop strategies for that. You know, if the pattern is too fast, you can mark a position on the screen where you're going to be at that point in time, so that you know exactly how it's going to come at you every single time. If it's impossible to dodge, you can just bomb through it. So, knowing what's wrong with what you're doing is important to figuring out how to improve it. Another huge thing is to make use of the whole screen. It's really tempting when you start playing any shooting game to just kind of hug the bottom, because it's easy to think about conceptually. I'm moving in one direction along this line. I'm nice and comfortable here. You know, things can move on one side of me, they can move on the other side of me. I don't need to care about what's up or down. Just side to side, that's all. But some things are only possible to do if you move two-dimensionally. And often at the higher level of play, if you want to go into scoring, for example, it's really important to get closer to enemies, to either point blank them or to take them out more quickly. And so you have to get used to moving and dodging in 2 dimensions. And even sometimes you'll run into situations where things that look like you can collide with them aren't possible to run into them. So you can actually sit directly on top of some bosses, and you might be perfectly safe there. Whereas from the outside, it looks like, oh, I'm inside of this giant machine, I should be dead. If you never get off of that baseline, you're never going to have that experience. You're never going to find an easier way to do things. So, to that end, it's important to experiment whenever you can. It's really surprising how often you'll find a really simple solution to a very complicated problem. I don't have a good example here, but you know, there's often a safe spot or some special trick you can use to manipulate a pattern in a way that makes it incredibly easy to dodge, whereas if you tried to do it otherwise, it would be ridiculously difficult. And then, of course, practice. It's unfortunately kind of the biggest sticking point of the genre. It's absolutely necessary to practice to get any good. But you don't need to strictly memorize things in kind of a linear fashion. You know, what you really need is a sense for what's going to happen and approximately when, so that you can adapt to changes on the fly. No 2 runs are ever going to be exactly the same, but if you know enough about the game to understand what impact your decisions will have on what's going to come next, then you can start to develop a strategy, and you can really, you know, push it and go for a clear. There's also a lot of replays available, you know, especially now with YouTube. There's tons and tons and tons of videos of, you know, different strategies for different areas or bosses or whatever. There's even super plays that are available to watch online for free. It might seem really tempting to be like, oh, this guy has the best score in the world. I'm going to watch his play and I'm going to copy that. On the one hand, it'll probably help you improve. You'll learn from him, you'll learn from what he's doing. But if you're just rote memorizing, you won't understand why. And the why is the most important part. Knowing, you know, what he's doing at a certain point in time is all well and good, but if you don't understand why he's doing it, there's no point.
Yeah, that's right. And some of these things that the player that you're watching play is hard to execute.
Yeah.
And it's hard to actually do their route because your skills aren't there yet. And Plus, it's not helpful. You're having some. It almost feels like someone's watching over your shoulder, and you're kind of copying. Take what you will. Study the best thing, but sometimes you're not able to replicate that. So, watch the ones that you can do rather than what you can't in those replays. They are very.
Planning ahead is also hugely important. You know, I don't want to say you should be thinking about it 24/7 because obviously you won't. But it's you know, if I have 5 minutes sometime and I'm away from a console, I might stop and think, you know, what would happen if? And I start, you know, analyzing an experiment in my head of what I might try on the next run. It's often some of the best ideas will come after a little bit of a break or when you're not looking at the game directly. You know, you have these kind of sudden moments where you're like, oh, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Maybe I should try that. So, another thing is that games can be really, really different. Some games are really encouraging about, you know, using bombs, and they give you lots of resources. They really want you to have a chance of surviving. And other games are really punishing. There are games which will actually get much, much, much more difficult if you bomb a lot. They will get much more difficult if you don't die. There are games where you actively have to suicide in order to keep yourself alive long enough to clear. So it's important to learn as much as you possibly can before you put in the first credit, before you start to approach the game. Because it can make a really big difference in how you proceed. So a great example is that there's two very famous shmup developers. Cave makes a lot of modern bullet hell shooters, and they're one of the, if not outright, the largest producer that's currently on the market. Their general strategy is we're going to give you a lot of resources. You're only going to be able to get 2 extends during the game, and there might be 1 or 2 hidden extends in the stages that you can unlock by fulfilling some criteria. We're going to give you tons of bombs. If you use them, your score is going to be totally compromised. If you die, your score is going to be totally compromised. But you have tons of stuff available to you if you just want to clear the game. There's another company, Rising, which went out of business not so long ago, which has a completely different idea, where if you start getting more than 2 lives, the game becomes punishingly difficult. You actively have to kill yourself to keep it within manageable difficulty level. You bomb frequently, but not for survival purposes, for score. You can't reactively bomb. You have to know that you're going to get screwed, so you have to do it in advance, or you have to have, you know, a specific target that you're aiming for. So, and that leads me to the last point here. Bombs exist for a reason. If you're dying with bombs in stock and you don't know why, you have a problem. Finally, this is a quote from Tsuneki Ikeda, the founder of Cave, about kind of shooting game philosophy and practice. He says, "It is a matter of experience. In other words, you must practice. After you play enough, you will understand the rules and patterns of the enemy placements and attacks. Also, in order to become better more quickly, you need to carefully analyze the spots where you died and develop strategies to deal with those situations. If this kind of experimentation starts to become tedious, just do what feels right. Even if you become good, if you aren't enjoying the game itself, then there's a chance you're missing the point. If you play enough so that you can clear the game on 1 credit, then you can start watching other skilled players' replays and start to find your own playing style. And the breadth of shooting games will open up for you, I think." So, here's some resources. We have more in the handout that's up here by the projector. You're all welcome to grab a copy of that if you haven't already. And with that, we are going to start the demonstration.
Yeah, let's get going. Okay, so now what we're going to do is